Anywho, never had that happen before, and sort of right at an interesting spot for that break to happen. So let me, if I may, just finish this quickly. I'm sort of at the end of it. Long story short, he said good news and bad news. He gave me an A on the paper. He's setting me up. He sees that arrogance and that ego puff up in me. What I was getting ready to say is I remember very clearly in my little arrogant head, I was thinking the reason he had called me into his office was because it would be too painful for the other students, many of whom were older than me, to hear this, because he was really laying it on. And I thought, well, Dr. Harvey's getting close to retiring. The rumor was the dean was going to allow him to handpick his successor because he was that well known in the field. And I thought, hey, here we go, So when he's got me where he wants me, he clears his throat and reminds me that he also had bad news. Good news, bad news. And the bad news is he gave me an F in life. Imagine that. The professor that you so admire, the person you've read their books, you've known them for 3.5 months, they give you an A on your paper and an F in life. And he said, William, I'm of the professional opinion that you are correct in your assessment that your soon-to-be ex-wife, Shannon, is dependent. That's highly dysfunctional. I'm also of the professional opinion that there's only one thing worse than that, young man, and it's you. You created this dysfunction. You created this dependency, and you think you can march into my office and manipulate me into colluding with you and feeling sorry for you. He said, son, not only are you in the wrong office, but you're probably in the wrong program. I don't feel sorry for you. I feel sorry for her. And then he went on to say, let me ask you a couple of questions. I bet that you were right in every argument. I bet you had to have the last word in every argument. I bet it was always your way. I bet you solved problems when you weren't asked for, just to listen. And he went on and on and on. I thought, holy cow, it felt like a Truman Show movie. Like he'd been watching our relationship for the last 7 years, and he had me. And it really, I felt sick, to be honest with you. And so, at any rate, while I was almost through with the conversation, he goes, and while we're at it, while I'm giving you some feedback, son, let me just share one other observation with you. I don't think you're going to graduate from this program. Your lack of self-awareness is appalling, but when I couple that with your South Carolina chip on your shoulder, it's going to make it virtually impossible for you to handle the kind of feedback I plan to give you. I don't know if any of you watched House of Cards, but Kevin Spacey's character was from Gaffney, South Carolina. If any of you have seen The Big Peach on I-85 between Atlanta and Charlotte, that's where I'm from, Gaffney. And Kevin Spacey's character was pretty on point. But he invited me, though, to consider that. He goes, but I promise you this. Whether you graduate or not, if you figure out why you did that to her for however long you're here, whether it's 1 more semester or 5 more years, you'll get your money's worth out of the program, whether you graduate or not. And with that, he turned his back, and that's how I was dismissed from his office. And just for good measure, as I was walking out, he opened back up the Bible and began reading again, and he started humming Amazing Grace, I think just to underscore the point he was trying to make with this 27-year-old South Carolina chip on my shoulder. It changed my life. I didn't like it. I went out that night and had a lot to drink with my friends, and they did exactly what I wanted them to do. They colluded with me and said, what a hypocrite, what a jerk. But even then, deep down, I knew there was something. He was the only person who had sort of not taken my side, and it turns out he was right. Now, just for the record, my ex-wife, Shannon, has watched the TED Talk, and she's read the first chapter, and she said that, and I quote, it's directionally correct, or directionally accurate. So she would probably have a few different views on some things, and honestly, she'd probably be right, but I think it's pretty close to home. The last interaction I had with Dr. Harvey, he had Parkinson's. He passed in 2015. And I emailed him and told him that exchange changed my life, and I was working on a book and thinking about a TED Talk and some other things, and wanted to tell him how much it meant to me. And his wife Beth had to type his reply to me, and it said, "Dear William, for God's sake, I would hope by now you know I take no credit for any growth you may have experienced during your time with me, nor any blame for future regression." JBH. And that was it. So that conversation, I didn't realize it at the time. He never talked about Carl Jung. He never talked about the shadow. He never talked about human motivation. But what he did was hold up a mirror and show me that shadow side. And that was what I needed to see. And it literally, that's the trajectory I've been on for the last 27 years, 26 years since that conversation. So I'd like to give you an opportunity to, this is not going to assess whether you made an A on the survey or an F in life. It's a short form version of an assessment that allows you to determine your leadership style. And there are two ways that you can do this. So if you've got your I can't believe as a professor I'm actually saying this. If you've got your smartphone, please pull them out. And you don't have to hold them under the table. You can pull them out, and or if you've got a tablet or anything like that connected to Wi-Fi where you can get online, please do that now. There are two ways. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to self-assess. The first way is you can just go out to www.ALPfree, and that stands for Actualized Leader Profile, ALPfree.com, and click that purple right here. Let's see if there's, well, it won't quite make it that far, where it says click here to complete the free short form version of the survey. It's not showing up. Anyway, that little bar there. So you can go to alpfree.com and click on that button, and that'll take you to a very short survey of word pairs. You just complete that and enter your name, and you'll get your results. Or the other way you can do this, if you want to download my free app, is just to text my name to the number 36260. So if you just text Will Sparks, can be all caps or all lowercase, it doesn't matter, Will Sparks to the number 36260, you can download my app, and you just add it to your home screen. If you choose to do that, you'll receive this message, and you click on that, add to home screen, and then from there you click on ALP survey. So you can do either or both if you would like to take the assessment. Again, it's alpfree.com, or if you text my name, Will Sparks, to 36260 and download it to your home screen, and then once it's loaded, click ALP survey. Either way will take you to this. This is the short form survey. Let me give you a moment to complete that. So again, you go to alpfree.com and you have these word pairs, or you can download the app by texting Will Sparks to the number 36260, or both. You can do either or both, and that'll take you to this short survey here, which is designed to measure your motive, need, and the resulting style. So please answer it honestly. It's just for you, and you can share that with anyone that you might want to. If there's a coworker, spouse, significant other, anyone else that you might want to complete it, please feel free to do that. Okay, so let me see if you've completed it yet. Let me just see a show of hands. I just want to. All right, I'm going to just give another minute here for folks who are still finishing up. There's no right or wrong, there just is. Okay, so as you're finishing up, now I promised we were going to be done at 2, and we had an unscheduled exit, so I'm going to hustle up here so I can keep my commitment to you all. So if you're still taking it, please finish doing that, and we'll go ahead and just dive back in. That free short form and the full version of the assessment as well measures your dominant motive need. What you get in the full version is you get a percentile score for all three motive needs and an estimation of your self-actualization as well, which is not in this free version here. But this is the heart of the matter. It measures three motive needs and the resulting style and unique leadership shadow that emerges from each of these. So these three needs were actually first uncovered by the late Harvard psychologist David McClellan, who said there are three unique drivers, motive needs that drive our behavior: the need for achievement, and I call that style the achiever; the need for affiliation, I call that style the affirmer, the red affirmer, the achiever's green; and the need for power, and I call that style the assertor. So if you look on the slides here, there's a unique style with each of those: achievers, affirmers, and asserters. The achiever is the gold star, with the trophy. The affirmer icon is the relationship, people talking, sharing. And the assertor is the Thor's hammer. All right? We like to be in control even over weather, and so that's meant to indicate sort of total control. There's a unique shadow with each of these as well. Leadership shadow. The leadership shadow for achievers is a fear of failure. The leadership shadow for affirmers is a fear of rejection. And the leadership shadow for asserters is a fear of betrayal. And if there's not anything else that I say to you today, I would just invite you to reflect on this at some point. The $64,000 question of all of this presentation and all of my work is simply this: the more you fear something, the more likely you are to experience it. Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz and went on to great fame with his book Man's Search for Meaning, said that the tragic irony of the human condition, think about it, it's ironic. The very thing we're trying to avoid, the very thing we fear, when we let fear drive our behavior, we increase the likelihood that we're going to experience it. And I'll give you just a quick example of that for those of you that are achievers. Detailed-oriented, uber-efficient, very organized. That shadow side causes you to micromanage under stress. And when you micromanage, you will either limit your career trajectory because you'll be seen as more of a contributor and less of a leader, or you will cause your team to essentially tap out and actually fail. And if you define failure as artificially limiting your career, which I would define that as a form of failure. The more you let that fear kick in, the more likely you are to experience it. It's the same for affirmers and rejection, the same for asserters and betrayal. And I'll try to illustrate that to you here in just a moment. So there are three styles that emerge: the achiever in the green, the affirmer in the red, and the assertor in the blue. And what I'd like to do is ask you to turn to your neighbor for just a moment and share your style, if you're comfortable doing that. And you can go beyond what's on your screen. So think about, what is your greatest strength as an achiever or an affirmer or an asserter? What is your greatest limitation? What is your greatest shadow limitation? And what triggers your shadow at work? Let me give you just a minute or two to share with your neighbor, and then we'll reconvene. All right, let me give you one more minute. So if the other person's been listening, switch sides now. You start doing the talking if you've been listening. What is your greatest strength, greatest limitation, and common workplace triggers? Okay. All right, let's bring it back to the presentation here, and I'd love to just quickly see a show of hands for how many of each of the three styles we have. So let me ask, how many achievers do we have? Just show of hands here. How many achievers? Got a bunch here in the middle back, over here, and over here on the corner. Okay, interesting. Here and then on the front corners. Affirmers. Let's see, where's the love? Holy moly. All right, the love in the room, the affirmers. All right, and asserters. Where's the power? Okay, all right. Affirmers have it, followed by asserters, and then achievers. I'm an asserter. That was, without using that term, that was what Dr. Harvey introduced me to. So let me talk about these styles and then talk about how to integrate that shadow piece in the little bit of time that we have left this afternoon. The book that you're going to be getting after the session today, the entire book lays out this model. It has interviews from business leaders, many names I think that you'll probably know and recognize. If there are any Episcopalians in our room, the presiding bishop, the Most Reverend Michael Curry, was kind enough to be interviewed for the book, and I'm Lutheran, and he made sure that, as a joking way, that he said, of course you can print that even as a Lutheran. Bishop Curry has a great sense of humor. And then in the final section of the book, section 4, is all about integrating that leadership shadow piece. So this is just an introduction. If you're interested in more, there's a lot more detail and information on managing that shadow piece. And again, I'm going to ask Beth to share the presentation for those of you that are interested. The achiever style, the fear of failure shadow, and there you see the light qualities of the achiever at his or her best. Detail-oriented, organized, efficient, thorough, focused, serious, all very strong qualities, sort of the backbone of performance in organizations. Very often you see sales, entrepreneurship, accounting, audit, information systems, individuals. Very, again, that sort of performance driver. Some famous, all of these faces you're going to see have been profiled by Harvard Business School. So Michael Jordan, the self-discipline, obviously, the focus on being the best. Lady Gaga, who's I think on tour now, very detail-oriented, shows the same. Oprah, Bill Gates, focus on success, improvement, discipline, winning, all of these sort of things. But here's look at the shadow, though, of the achiever and how those light qualities go dark when activated. So detail-oriented is great, but it can become narrow-minded under stress. And we'll talk about some of the triggers here in just a few minutes. Organized becomes inflexible. You can go down and across for all of those. And so that's the shadow piece that often leads to micromanaging under stress. And I would argue, and I think research supports this, increases the probability of failure. Carl Jung talked about this paradox of bringing about the thing you fear the most. Carl Jung said, quote, "You meet your destiny on the road you took to avoid it." You meet your destiny on the road you took to avoid it. And in this case, destiny is failure. You meet it by micromanaging, the very thing you're trying to avoid. Same with the affirmers and same with the asserters as well. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the additional details around the achiever style. The tagline of an achiever is, "I'll do it my way." So under stress, they roll up their sleeves, get out of the way, I'll get it done. I want it to be my way. I want it to be perfect. And here are some of the common characteristics of the achievers. Very deep technical expertise. They prefer planned, organized, sort of focus as opposed to spontaneity. Achievers need to be mindful, can be risk averse. And so you got to know when to go all in. If you've got 70% of the information and the like, making a decision. And so when an achiever becomes more comfortable making a decision based on some intuition, that's when they begin to really self-actualize the benefits of that style. My wife, Erin, is a 97% achiever. When you take the full ALP, you get the percentiles, and I'm a 3, so it leads to some really interesting discussions around the dinner table. We've got an international trip coming up in 2 weeks, and her color-coded spreadsheet packing list has found the counter, the kitchen countertop. Boom. Everything. Confirmation, flight numbers, hotel reservations, her packing list. You name it. It is uber organized. And, for me, with 3% the morning of, I'm running out with I hope I've got my American Express and my passport, and anything else I figure I can buy if I need to. But I've really come to appreciate that higher score and the benefits that it brings. I wish I had more of that, honestly. Detailed, fact-based. From a communication perspective, achievers tend to be a little more introverted, less self-disclosure. They are very precise and organized. And for the asserters in the room that may be working with an achiever or reporting to an achiever or living with an achiever, I have found over the years that one of the pet peeves they have of asserters is our tendency to embellish the story. We take about 85 or 90%, but we add maybe a little bit more to make a point or something. And so embellishing can be a real trigger for achievers because they're precise, very precise in their language and the like. If you're trying to influence, communicate more effectively with an achiever, provide as many details, and if you're an affirmer, this is really important for affirmers, avoid starting a sentence with I feel. I feel like yada, yada, yada. Because whatever comes out next is subconsciously discounted by the achiever, and to a lesser degree by asserters, because their take is going, what do you mean you feel? What does the data suggest? What does a trend analysis tell us? What are the facts of the situation and the data that we have to observe? And so even if you do feel a certain way, you may want to rephrase that to say, after a careful review of the trend analysis over the last 18 months, the data would seem to suggest to me that we, and then whatever it is you feel or intuit, plug in there. So be mindful of not starting sentences with I feel. There's a superpower with each of the three styles, and the superpower for the achiever is sort of Superman's X-ray vision. And the reason I say that is because achievers have an uncanny knack for looking through a problem. They can almost see through the problem and understand the root cause, while affirmers and achievers tend to gloss over some of those details or not mind them as carefully. That attention to detail not only allows them to see beneath or through a problem, but also to predict unintended consequences of a proposed solution. We may throw something out and go, we can just do X, Y, and Z, and the achiever is much more able to say, well, if you do that, here's the downstream impact we're likely to experience. And so it's this uncanny ability, almost X-ray vision that Superman has to see through the problem. Okay, for the majority of folks in the room, the affirmer style is where we're going to focus on next, and that is the relationship-driven style, and the shadow of the affirmer is a fear of rejection. And so at our best, affirmers are friendly, empathetic, loyal, helpful, collaborative, generous, all of these great qualities around working well with others, supporting others, encouraging others, sort of have the natural wiring for what we call in the leadership literature servant leadership, which has become a very popular model today. We talk, how do we invert the pyramid so that the leader's not at the top? You invert it so that he or she carries the burden and the weight on his or her shoulders, and really there to serve and to help and support others. And so affirmers sort of have that natural wiring more so than the rest of us. Some famous affirmers, Charlie Brown, the famous Snoopy, as I used to call it, the Peanuts cartoons, Mother Teresa, Nelson Mandela, Gandhi. Not surprising that many of these are from faith-based traditions. Again, a focus on empathy, listening, helping, and encouraging others. But the shadow of that affirmer is a fear of rejection, a fear of separation. And we are more likely to meet our destiny on the road we took to avoid it. So if an affirmer is avoiding conflict, You know, there's that wise saying from Eastern tradition, I believe it's Taoist, that says, if you avoid conflict to keep the peace, you will wage a war within yourself. Avoiding conflict to keep the peace, don't rock the boat, you begin waging a war within yourself. And that's why many affirmers, when they've finally been pushed to the limit, when that straw that finally breaks the emotional back, when an affirmer loses it and they're triggered, they're really triggered. Because oftentimes a lot has been building up. And so that avoiding conflict or being overly accommodating can be where we experience that rejection or separation. So you can go down and across again for all of these light qualities and how they go dark under stress. The tagline for the affirmer is "We'll do it your way," and the real focus is on people and relationships. Strong interpersonal skills, very intuitive, friendly, outgoing, excellent listeners, loyal, sometimes to a fault. And again, that helpful is good, but can be overly accommodating, maybe can be naive. Others can take advantage of that if you're not mindful and not careful. So, I wanted to talk about communicating with some of the communication style specifics of the affirmer. And so, affirmers tend to be more relaxed, they're easygoing, they're cooperative, friendly, patient. If you are trying to influence or persuade an affirmer, they often see challenges and issues and decisions. They have a double or dual bottom line. I mean, the bottom line is the financial bottom line. But very often they have this feedback, this second double loop where they go, well, what's the impact on our team? What's the impact on our members? What's the impact on our community? And so if you're wanting to be more persuasive or influential with an affirmer, focus on the impact on others. Because yes, there's a financial bottom line, but then there's that relational piece as well, and it's automatic. It's just sort of this double loop that many affirmers do. And also avoid assuming that their silence means agreement or endorsement. Many times an affirmer will sort of tap out of a heated conversation or a heated meeting if an asserter or an achiever becomes very outspoken and sort of very dominant. But you should not assume that that silence is golden, because very often they've just elected to not try to fight that day. So if you are working with an affirmer or living with an, probe that a little bit and go, I've noticed you've gotten quiet. What are you really thinking? Can take just a little bit of time on the part of a leader, but it can make a huge difference in the final decision you may end up making or the recommendation you may end up recommending. The superpower of the affirmer is spidey sense. It's intuition. The recently retired dean of the engineering school at Princeton Ivy League engineering school, not psychology, not philosophy, not religion, engineering, said he was convinced, based on his 30 years of research, that intuition should be considered the sixth sense, just as much as hearing, sight, taste. And so, we hear about people that are more intuitive and people that sort of have this gut feeling or even the sixth sense. Affirmers have that more. We all have it, but affirmers are tapped into it usually more than achievers and asserters. And so that superpower, if you remember, spidey sense tingles when there's danger, afoot or around the corner, and that's that sort of intuitive piece. And affirmers that have that and that trust it and tap into it often have a whole source of data that the rest of us miss. But you may not want to say, my spidey sense tells me this is why we should do X, Y, and Z. Again, you may want to go back to, after a careful review of the historical trend data for the last 18 months, it would seem to suggest to me that, depending on who you are influencing. All right, and then finally, the second largest group that we have are the asserters, and I'd raise my hand with this group. This is my style. Thor's hammer, need for power, I'd like to be in control. Our shadow is a fear of betrayal, and you see the positive qualities on the left there at our best: confident, decisive, candid, courageous, competitive, sort of natural leaders. Many asserters have found themselves or put themselves in positions of leadership throughout their life, early on in school and sports, athletics, student government. Would much rather be in charge and making the decisions than relying on someone else. So very confident individuals. Some famous asserters: Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk. I could have put his picture there. He's been profiled by Harvard. Serena Williams, Michelle Obama, Steve Jobs. A lot of C-suite leaders in business. Not all, but a lot have that asserter drive. I would say probably 65%, which is a pretty high percentage. Confident, controlled, powerful individuals. But the shadow of an asserter is a fear of betrayal. And one of the real shadow traits that we have to become aware of and manage is skeptical. Many asserters go through life, both at the office, at the club, and at home, with a trust but verify mode. And that worked great in the end of the Cold War, between the U.S. and the former Soviet Union. Trust but verify, Ronald Reagan famously said. Of course we trust the Soviets, but we're going to verify everything they say. Well, a lot of asserters apply that into our personal relationships. And we increase the likelihood of feeling betrayed when we do that, because sometimes a person who knows they're not trusted will tap out the first chance they get. They will leave our club and go to another employer. They may tap out of a personal relationship. And then we feel betrayed because asserters will give you a laundry list of all of the things we did to support that person, how we mentored that person, our generosity, and all of that's true, usually, but there's that other side that we don't want to acknowledge, which was that sort of trust but verify mode. And so those light qualities go dark: arrogant, impatient, controlling, blunt, skeptical, and all of that we need to be very mindful of, because that can shut down the conversation and the productivity in a formal organizational environment. So the tagline of the achiever is, "I'll do it my way." Understand? The tagline of the affirmer is, "We'll do it your way." The tagline of the asserter is, the tagline of the affirmer is, "We'll do it your way." The tagline of the asserter is, "You'll do it my way." Asserters are less likely than achievers to roll up their sleeves and do the work. They will hire or fire appropriately to make sure the work gets done and give very candid feedback, but they tend to be more formal than achievers and asserters. A lot of positive here: results-driven, confident, strategic. Asserters tend to be very strategic. Asserters are comfortable with ambiguity. Asserters are willing to take a risk. When they feel like they've got enough information, they'll roll the dice, and very often that's why they find themselves in increasingly higher levels of leadership, because of the success that often breeds. I've got bias for action in quotation marks because my late mentor, I dedicated the book to Dr. Dominic J. Moneta, who passed away in October of last year. Dom Moneta was the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Development under Dick Cheney and Bush the Father administration, when Dick Cheney was the Secretary of Defense. So Dom had an above top secret clearance, Sicilian American, and he had so much blue on his page that it said, I ran out of ink trying to. He was an asserter's asserter, all right? Very charismatic, very confident, very decisive. And I used to have impatient on this presentation. And he took his blue pen and he marked it out and he put in quotes, "Bias for action, Will." I prefer bias for action, which is a politically correct way of saying we're impatient. So there you go. From now on, if somebody tells you you're impatient, if you're an asserter, you can correct them and say, "I simply have a bias for action." But one of our Achilles' heel is being slow to trust others. And that comes from, very often, a lack of trusting ourselves. Because we know what we're capable of doing, and many asserters project that onto others. And if we don't trust ourselves deep down, we can have trouble trusting others. So that can offer many people, that can be a transformative element to work on, is increasing that trust with others. To communicate more effectively with asserters, they are direct, intense, confident, very fast-paced often. They usually are multitasking. If you've got a 15-minute meeting scheduled and you can do it in 3, they will appreciate that 12 minutes they get back. And so they like the headlines, the big picture. If they want more detail, they'll ask for it. Many folks fail to optimize their meetings with asserters because they want to start with the 120-slide PowerPoint deck so you can understand my thinking process so that I can support the conclusion that we'll get to in 2.5 hours when I'm through with the day. And the asserter is sitting here thinking, give me the recommendation. If I have a question, I'll ask you. Because I've got 4 of the plate spinning, and if they like the recommendation or they agree with you, you can move on and avoid that. So they're strategic. They want the headline or the executive summary. Be prepared to go into detail if you need to, but very often starting with that will cause their eyes to sort of shut. Don't take their bluntness or their probing or their questions personally. They're just in that zone and in that mode at work very often, and that's what you are likely to get. Very often an asserter will follow up later after the day with maybe an email or a text or phone call. By the way, how is Freddie doing, or your daughter or your mom, or whatever you may have going on in your personal life. You may not get that in the heat of battle, but you very often will get it later. The superpower for the asserter is, of course, if we've got Thor's hammer, then we have to have I'm not an Apple. Anyone here can help me with a MacBook? This is, let's see. Let's see if I can bring this back up. Let's see. I think, is Beth out there? I think it's in her email, and I don't want to, let's see, I don't see it here. All right, so in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and keep scooting here with the superpower of the asserter is vitality, and that sort of Thor, that sort of lightning and energy and power. Many asserters can sort of inject that enthusiasm and that vitality into a group setting. They have an ability to help support teams and inspire teams, actually, to accomplish more than they normally could without them. So very often you see that sort of asserter style that can go a long way into helping build confidence, set aggressive goals, set a stretch goal, but then inspire others to do that. And in that sense, it is sort of injecting that energy of that vitality into the group. So but it just clicked off. And so I didn't know if you had the presentation in your email or on your desktop. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to save the last few minutes for any questions or comments, and we do have 2 microphones set up here. So if you've got anything that's on your mind, please feel free, be thinking about that and feel free to ask that. I'll be asking. Thank you very much. Let's see here. Thor's hammer. So we were, let's see. We were getting on down here. There we go. Perfect. All right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. All right. So what other challenges we have? This is, so be thinking about any questions you might have. Again, we'll share the presentation, and we've got copies of the book for you after we're done this afternoon. But what I'd like to do is take the last few minutes that we have together and really get to the heart of the matter, which is the shadow piece. And I don't know if you could, hopefully you can read these quotes from where you are. The first 2 are from Carl Jung. The first one you've seen about we have to make the darkness conscious, not imagine figures of light to become enlightened. The second quote from Jung is just reminding us, hey, it's not personal. We all have a shadow. So it's not that you have one and I don't. It's not and in fact, the leadership shadow is a sliver of our personal shadow, which is something that we, acquire and carry around with us for our whole life. And so it's not personal. We all have it. But what can be personal is refusing to acknowledge it, denying it, repressing it, ignoring it, projecting it onto other. Projection is when there are things about yourself that you find so distasteful that you deny them, but you notice them in other people, and so you project. That's projection. And so a lot of times we reveal more about ourselves than we realize when we're criticizing others or the like. And so that's projection. And then finally, from the I Ching here, this last quote: only when we have the courage to face things in other words, ourselves, as we truly are, without any self-deception, without being a victim, without blaming other people, when we own it, that is when this light and this path to success will be realized. And owning it means that we reclaim all of our freedom, owning our own stuff. It also means we're totally responsible for ourselves. And a lot of people would rather forfeit responsibility if they can get out of that ownership piece. So let me quickly go through the shadow archetype here, and then we'll have some time for some questions. So what is the shadow? I've been talking about the leadership shadow. What is that? Metaphorically, it is the Mr. or Mrs. Hyde to our Dr. Jekyll persona. The Dr. Jekyll persona is how we want others to experience us. So, bless you, how we're hardworking, we're funny, we're conscientious, whatever, however we want people to experience us. We all have a persona. It's a mask. And there's a reason we have them. That's a good thing to have. We're dressed a certain way. We're at a conference now, so we're showing up in a different way. The Mr. or Mrs. Hyde is the shadow. That is the other. And that's what can get triggered, and so we need to be mindful of that. And it's grounded in negative emotions, fear, anger, rage, jealousy, hate. So these grounded emotions that we have, and we push them down until we can have those emerge or erupt, as the case may be. The acronym there, HALT, is a well-known acronym, HALT, and I added the second T there. So be mindful if you are hungry. This is when the shadow is more likely to occur. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired, and I added tipsy. All right, so that's how appropriate that we're at Margaritaville. I put on LinkedIn, I posted a picture before we got started, and I said, I'm really, really trying to focus and be professional, but the struggle is real, because the more Jimmy Buffett I hear, the more I want to go out and have a cheeseburger and a margarita. So, but that hungry, angry, lonely, tired, tipsy, that's why a lot of couples have those Friday night fights, because more of those are in play. We're hungry, we're exhausted, it's been a long week, we're having our second or third glass of wine or beer or whatever, and we let that guard down, and boom, that can emerge. So be mindful of that HALTT, halt. And then finally, that last quote at the bottom there, that is from Carl Jung's last interview with the BBC in 1959, when the interviewer asked him, Herr Dr. Jung was Swiss-German, Herr Dr. Jung, at what point in your esteemed career were you able to put the shadow to bed and not have to worry about those shadow qualities given your enlightenment? And he chuckled and he puffed his pipe and he said, my dear fellow, the best we can ever hope for is a lifelong negotiation with the other, meaning the shadow. So it's not a one and done. That's what we have to give ourselves some grace. It's non-linear, it's non-sequential. But it's just sort of trying to get a little bit better every day, managing that piece. And I think from Jung saying the best anyone can hope for is a lifelong negotiation with that shadow piece. Another quote that I wanted to put up here that I think is really puts this, in my view at least, in the proper perspective. Jung saying that this sort of, it's a moral problem. It challenges our ego personality, because no one wants to admit that we're arrogant or accommodating or critical. It's like we don't go around we talk about our strengths. I'm organized. I'm not inflexible. I'm organized. If I'm an affirmer, I'm generous and loyal and helpful and collaborative. I'm not accommodating. I'm not conflict avoidant. And for the asserter, I'm confident and results oriented. I am not arrogant or controlling. And so it is being more comfortable with understanding how this is going to challenge us, and becoming conscious of it requires this moral effort. It recognizes this darker aspect that we all have in our personality, the shadow, as present and real, not something that you have to deal with, not something that I used to have to deal with. It is present and real for all of us. And I think when we have that hyper-awareness, when we have that, we're much better able to manage it. Jung said it's better to be whole than perfect. And what he meant by that was perfection's impossible. And, you're better off acknowledging that darker side, because when you acknowledge it, you begin to integrate it. So Jung used the metaphor of the talons of say, an eagle as the shadow, and the more you deny it and say, that's not me, the deeper they go in your shoulders. The more they've got you. It's got you. The more you repress it, the deeper it goes. So you don't want to indulge it, but you want to accept it and acknowledge it. And especially in your work setting, in your club, giving your team members an opportunity to maybe do their little free assessment and give each other permission to call it out when you see it with each other. That's when you open it up. That's when you acknowledge it. He said the talons release. It's not magic. It's still a lifelong negotiation with the other, but you're much better able to have that negotiation once you've had the courage to acknowledge it. So Viktor Frankl, I mentioned him earlier. This is really the $64,000 question of all of this. Paradoxical intent. The more you fear something, the more likely you are to experience it. That is, if you want to have a sense of what it's like to have the Wharton MBA program, this is the only book they have in that class is Man's Search for Meaning. It's taught by Dr. Michael Eusine, and they do a lot of other cool things too. They go to Gettysburg and they have all of these visits around leadership. But the only book they have in the class is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And I think for our purposes, this is the so what of all of this. The more we let our shadow drive our behavior, the more likely we are to experience failure if you're an achiever, rejection if you're an affirmer, betrayal if you're an asserter. So that's sort of the so what of all of this piece here. So I'm gonna include this. I'm gonna zip through this in the interest of time. I do want to hit just a couple of other slides with each style, and then we will open it up for some Q&A. Some of the shadow triggers for the achiever: the prospect of losing, imperfection, not being done your way. Here's a big one too to be mindful of if you're an achiever: ambiguity, the gray, a lack of black and white, a lack of policy, a lack of procedure, a lack of consistency. Those are the triggers that we often experience, and the trap for the achiever is to become a micromanager. And you can see on the presentation here, when we send it out, I think you'll have a much better way of seeing it, and it's in the book as well, that in our shadow, achievers create what I call a detached culture, because you're doing all the work in micromanaging, so folks just check out. You need to be really mindful of that, because that's where that lower performance that can lead to failure often comes from. From an inclusion perspective, if we hear a lot about being a more inclusive leader and shadow or implicit bias is nothing more than shadow bias, and we have them based on these three styles. And so the achiever needs to be mindful of taking too much credit and criticizing others. As Don Manette, I mentioned, my late mentor, said, credit and blame smell the same. I love that. Credit and blame smell the same. Be careful when you raise your hand to take all the credit, because tomorrow when things get sideways, or next week or next month, you've still got your hand up. You have to be mindful of that. So criticizing others and often taking too much credit. To actualize the achiever style, this is the last slide for the achiever, and this is all in section 4 of the book, Cultivate Abundance. Critical thinking or being critical is one of the real shadow scarcity, that's sort of one of the shadow traits that achievers have. If you cultivate gratitude and an abundant mindset, it is impossible to feel critical and scarce when you've developed this. And you can develop this growth mindset and more of a win-win perspective for the achiever. For the affirmer, some obvious triggers for that fear of rejection shadow: conflict, having those difficult conversations, saying no to someone who is used to you always saying yes. And so the management trap here is avoiding conflict, hoping that things will get better, and they rarely do. They usually get worse, and that's the challenge for affirmers. Now look, if you look at the shadow side of the affirmer, look down at the shadow culture that's created affirmers leading a team in his or her shadow, instead of having candid communication and sort of realistic goals for the future and being supportive. It's needy, polite conversation, and often unrealistic. So very surface level, friendly, and all of that, but beneath the surface, there's often a high level of frustration. So something to be very mindful of for affirmers. The micro transgression for as far as inclusion with the affirmer is that affirmers are often silent when they need to speak out. So conforming to others, conforming to a group norm. If you see someone being interrupted, you see someone being talked over, remaining silent and allowing that to happen is often one of the challenges. And when you break that cycle and you say, wait a minute, before we move on, I want Fred to finish or Sally to finish, or you weren't done yet. You can break that and develop that ability to be more inclusive as a leader. The anecdote for the affirmer is connection to purpose, identifying and living your purpose, saying no to manage your time and your boundaries, and then taking action. Affirmers are very reflective. They tend to be incredibly self-aware, but you want to take that awareness and that reflection and translate that into action. Many times the affirmer will have, there's another retreat. I'm going to do the yoga retreat next week, and then there's another book I'm going to read, and that's fine. I'm all for that. But at some point, when you get it, you got to take action from that insight to change behavior. And usually that means saying no. Usually that means enforcing your personal and professional boundaries. And usually that means, instead of avoiding conflict, taking a deep breath, thinking about what you want to say, and then having that difficult conversation. And the irony of all of that is that decreases the likelihood that you're going to experience that rejection or separation. I have worked with a number of leaders over the last 20 plus years in Charlotte, managers who were strong affirmers, and their unwillingness to confront a problem situation, their unwillingness to deal with a low performer. In a couple of cases, one person was demoted and had no more direct reports, rejection, right? Okay, separation. The other person was close to retirement, wasn't quite ready to retire, and was encouraged to take a package. And the CEO said, you don't have the ability to make those tough decisions. And it was about 3 years before this individual was ready to fully retire. There's the separation. You see it playing out. So by having those difficult conversations and taking action, you decrease the likelihood of that separation or rejection. And then finally, for the asserter, some of our triggers: vulnerability, being wrong. It's like Fonzie from Happy Days. Remember, he couldn't say he was wrong. He had a hard time getting out that word. It's sort of like we have that as well. Asking for help or not being able to help someone. Those are some of our common triggers. And if you look down on the shadow side of this graph here on the right side, there's my F in life, because that was the dynamic in my failed marriage, that dependency. And this is the most common culture we see in organizational settings as well. So individuals are reactive, compliant, and over-rely on us, as opposed to this proactive, creative, with mutual shared accountability. And many times as asserters, we sort of want to bang our fist down and say, you need to think for yourselves, you need to be more accountable, you need to be more responsible. Where are those great decisions? Why do I have to do everything? And here's the Jerry Harvey story coming full circle. We have to look in the mirror and say, how much of this have I contributed to? How many problems did I step in and solve? How many times did I reinforce this cycle that I've now gotten tired of? And that's the transformative moment of this, using this leadership model and working with your teams in your club settings as well. The challenge for the asserter, not surprisingly, overconfidence is one of our implicit or shadow biases. Confirmation biases, when we tend to notice data to support our position, we ignore or discount or rationalize any other data points. So we tend to only focus on what supports our view. That leads to interrupting others, a condescending tone, that we often employ if we get triggered, and all of those are barriers or impediments to creating a more inclusive environment. Finally, for the asserter, the anecdote is assurance, and by that I mean psychological safety and forgiveness. And again, this is covered in great detail in sections 3 and 4 of the book. This notion of sort of feeling safe enough to let our guard down, to say we're sorry, to ask for help, to be less formal, to take ourselves a little less seriously, embracing vulnerability. Here's one of the ironies that I've discovered in the last 15 years of really digging into this research. Even though affirmers are the relationship-driven style, I would actually argue, and I think the data would support this, asserters crave authentic connection just as much, if not more so, than affirmers. Asserters crave authentic connection. But the price of admission for that is vulnerability, of letting your guard down, of being truly seen. And so many of us are not willing to pay that price. And so saying I'm sorry, saying I was wrong, forgiving yourself and others, a whole section in that, on that sort of transformative journey for the asserters as well as we move through this. So with that, I want to check my time here. We've got just a few minutes left before the 2 o'clock time. So we've got some microphones set up here. I wanted to ask for any comment, anything that's on your mind. It doesn't have to be about your particular style. It can be, but any thoughts about the model or anything at all. Please want to save some time to ask those. Yes, sir.
So, I mean, obviously you've been studying this for a long time. Mm-hmm. You mentioned your wife was a 97% when you do the
achiever. Mm-hmm.
Model. What have you seen as kind of the norm? I mean, are most people 90-something%?
Yep.
A little bit, or is there
Great.
30?
Yeah, let me answer that in two ways. One with some stats and then one sort of with the theoretical part of this. So men are 1.5 times more likely to be achievers. Women are 1.5 more times as likely to be affirmers. And men and women are equal on the asserter, need for power, and on their self-actualization scores. So from a gender perspective, that's how we see the breakdown. As far as its norm, so 97% is much higher than the average. So if you think about that, if you lined up 100 people at random and you measured them 1 to 100, she's all the way over at 97. But what I always tell people, it doesn't matter to me how much or how little green, red, or blue you have on your page. I'm an intense asserter, so I'm over the 75th percentile there. What matters is your self-actualization score. Because if your self-actualization score is lower, you and those in your orbit experience your shadow more frequently and more intensely. If your self-actualization score is higher, your threshold to get triggered is much higher. In other words, it takes a lot more to get triggered. And even when you do, you rebound quickly and you can catch yourself. So it's increasing the self-actualization score irrespective of how much or how little achievement, affiliation, or asserter. That's a great question. Thank you. Maybe time for one more. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yep. Great. That's a great question, and I get that often, and it actually perfectly sets up this last slide. Perfectly. So the goal is not to try to be more of an asserter if you're an affirmer. The goal is to increase your self-actualization, because if you look at this, and I don't know how well this is coming across here, hopefully you can see it. If you look in the middle, for affirmers, you see friendly and empathetic. That's natural. That doesn't require any effort for an affirmer. But by developing your self-actualization, and the antidote for the shadow is connection to your purpose, then actualized affirmers are friendly and decisive. They're empathetic and candid. And it feels like it's actually more of the asserter style, but it's just developing those self-actualization tendencies, because decisiveness, candor, solitude, being objective, dealing with facts, all of those are the qualities, or what I call the attributes, of self-actualized leaders, irrespective of whether you're an affirmer, an achiever, or an asserter. So it's not trying to be any more than, because that you can't do that. I mean, you can fake it for a while, but it just exhausts you. And if you do that, then you have to overcompensate when you get out of that professional setting. So it creates a whole other series of issues around energy management and the like. But if you develop and cultivate that self-actualization, that candor, that decisiveness, those become easier while you stay true to your authentic need, which in the example we're using, which I'm not saying is yours, but in the example it would be an affirmer, but an actualized affirmer, as opposed to one who's more conflict avoidant or maybe sugarcoats the truth a little bit more. So you can see here, this last slide, that is Abraham Maslow's picture. And he said, to the uninitiated, to those who don't understand self-actualization, they, meaning self-actualized individuals, are walking contradictions. And in fact, he said that should be the goal. Don't be either or, be both and. Be that walking contradiction. If you're an achiever cultivating abundance, detailed and organized, again, that's easy. But when you marry that with flexibility and spontaneity, that's that actualized achiever. We talked about the affirmer, and then finally for the asserter, confident, humble, that's that marrying, that sort of humility and that caring that comes from developing that assurance antidote for the shadow and cultivating that self-actualization aspect to allow you to be both and instead of either or. So it's my hope that you all will think about that tonight. Be mindful of that second T with all the wonderful margaritas floating around here and that shadow piece. And I hope everyone will consider that walking contradiction piece. Thank you so much for everything. I really appreciate it. Thank you.